occupied borderlands here in southern Arizona look like. And then we'll talk about the border militarization industrial complex, their direct connections and indirect connections, and a little bit about what we can do about it. Something that's not included in this presentation that I think is particularly important or relevant right now is, in addition to it being the same actors in terms of Israeli contracting companies and Mexican concrete companies building the walls, it's no mistake that there's coordination on a judicial level and on a policing level. There's been a lot of exchanges between Israeli forces and U.S. police departments in terms of how they militarize their policing of our communities. And that's something that I can't say I'm happy to talk about in this conversation as well, but I think it's worth talking about in this conversation as well. And we'll touch on it in a little bit later. So occupied Palestine. For folks who are not familiar with Palestine, kind of a quick overview. Occupied Palestine is these areas of the Gaza Strip in the West Bank. And it's the entirety of the land that was captured from 1948 onward, which was originally populated by the majority indigenous Arab Palestinian population. My father and my father's side of the family are what's considered 1948 Palestinians, and that we all initially had to leave in that first wave of migration out. And Israel is all of the post-1948 thefted land, which that excludes the West Bank and Gaza territories. The West Bank and Gaza territories are supposed to be sovereign entities. So here are some images from the occupied territories. So today, Palestinians continue to be bombed, besieged, and dispossessed by their Israeli occupiers with the full military and financial support of the United States government. There's not a single explanation for why the U.S. support continues for the occupations, but there's a lot of geopolitical reasons. Israel is a strong asset in the region. And being a proxy versus Iran. Christian evangelicals' obsession with Israel and end times prophecy. Michael Pence is a big believer in this, for example. The impact of arms sales in the U.S. military-industrial complex. We sell a lot of weapons to Israel, and we make a lot of money that way. The long-standing economic, cultural, and social ties between American Jews and Israeli Jews. AIPAC and other pro-Israel lobbying groups' impact on members of Congress and their staffers, which has become more prevalent in the news the past few years, controversially so, but still factually so. So here's a look at the wall winding through Palestine. And I just want you to kind of notice in this map how disjointed these territories look. So the West Bank wall was started being built in the year 2000, so over 20 years ago. It's over 440 miles long at this point. Occupied Palestine is just 260 miles long, to give you, so it's longer than than Palestine. And it's just 70 miles across. So it's a very small amount of the world we're talking about. 15% of the wall runs along Israel, while the remaining 85% cuts deep into the West Bank territory. So it's also a land grab. It measures up to 26 feet high, is fortified with intrusion detection equipment. Some more images of it with some of the murals that have gone up. So this drastically reduces the freedom of travel within the country, let alone in and out of the country. Reduction, it reduces the number of IDF checkpoints and road closures, so people are channeled into fewer checkpoints. Loss of land for development, that people just can't build. There's an increased difficulty accessing medical and educational services. You've got to get through these checkpoints and get through the barriers that may be on the other side of the wall. Restricted access to water resources, which is a very, very big deal in this area, as it is in southern Arizona. Family separation, very simple, very real. And it very much stifles popular uprisings and resistance movements. People cannot get to one another. They cannot communicate with one another. It's a real stark reminder of the duality of life and who holds power in Israel and the West Bank. Who's on one side of the wall and who's on the other side of the wall. And that's why a lot of people, instead of calling it a separation barrier or security fence, we do refer to it as an apartheid wall, such, reminiscent of South African apartheid. So I'm going to kind of zoom through the checkpoints in restricting movement. Here's some images of how crowded and tumultuous this process gets. This is daily life for Palestinians. It's important to remember. And as we go through these images, a lot of folks will find themselves reminded of images they've seen on the southern border here. So something that we can't avoid talking about is the settlements, which are militarized suburbs within the territories themselves. So from 1967 to the end of 2017, more than 200 Israeli settlements have been established in the West Bank. 133 of them are recognized by the Israeli government, which means about 70 of them aren't even recognized. They're just kind of squatting settlements, with, in theory, don't have permission to be there. 110 settlements were built without authorization, but with government support and assistance. They're quote-unquote illegal outposts. And over 620,000 Israeli citizens currently live in the settlements. So part of what the settlements are is what you would see in negotiation efforts called facts on the ground, where there's no point in where you lose the ability to negotiate over land that's in dispute, because settlements have just been posted there instead and claimed, and that's what we call facts on the ground negotiation. So these Israeli settlements are illegal under international law and under the Fourth Geneva Convention. Israel doesn't care, the United States doesn't care, but it is actually illegal. And here you see a Palestinian settler looking at a very nice settlement. So part of the problem with the settlements, it's not just that they exist and are land grabs and intrusions into Palestinian territory and sovereignty, but settler violence is a very real occurrence. And this is not unlike the kind of protest and militia-like violence we've started to see in the United States against certain communities. So these actions range from blocking roads to throwing stones at cars and houses, raiding villages and farmland, torching fields and olive groves, damaging crops and property, to physical assault, including Molotov cocktails and live fire. These accounts are particularly common among illegal outposts. So these are Israeli settlers as private citizens committing these crimes against Palestinian citizens. There are over 60,000 American citizens living in the West Bank. The most heinous forms of American frontier making and colonialism can be found in the Israeli settlements. Rugged individualism, subjugation of the native or savage, anti-democratic behavior, belief that the land was bestowed by God, or employing a chosen person syndrome, very conservative, very fundamentalistic, and very, unfortunately, violent at times. We have some images of violent settlers with firearms and whatnot. So the Gaza Strip. So this talks about migration in a lot of, and that's the movement of people. But the Gaza Strip is a very special example in this world of where the people in the Gaza Strip really cannot get out of the Gaza Strip. It is considered by most people to be an open air concentration camp at this point. It is like the slide says, we consider it a humanitarian disaster that's a direct result of official Israeli policy. Israel can choose to change its policy, but it does not. In early 2015, the UN Conference on Trade and Development published a report on the situation in Gaza. After 8 years of blockade, the report cautioned that without significant changes to Israeli policy, Gaza will have no chance of recovery and will become unlivable in 2020. That is this year. So this year, Gaza is officially considered unlivable by the UN. Although Israel has declared an end to its military administration, it does continue to control all critical aspects of life there. It controls the border crossings. It controls the movement of people and goods. It controls Gaza's sea and airspace. The Rafah crossing, which is subject to Egyptian control, has been closed for a few years. The Egyptian authorities opened it for only a few days every year. Gaza is very much isolated from the rest of the world, and it's very much a dire, critical situation. So in 2007, Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, and Israel has used this to control its blockade, to justify its blockade. And regardless of what you think of Hamas, it's important to remember that this was a democratic election that was internationally observed and certified. So as part of the blockade, Israel prohibited travel in and out of the Gaza, the import of goods into Gaza, including restrictions on food items, toys, and paper. According to documents exposed in October 2010, following the Freedom of Information petition, it emerged that Israel had employed a deliberative reductive strategy based on calculations of a minimal caloric intake for Gaza residents to survive. So everyone get that phrase, deliberative reductive policy. What does that mean? They're deliberately reducing the population in Gaza. So the blockades has driven Gaza's economic collapse, being bombarded by Israel's munitions periodically throughout the years has not helped. Unemployment can be as high as 50%. For women, it's 71%. 80% of Gaza's residents depend on humanitarian aid, and 60% suffer from insecurity. All right. So that is Gaza in the West Bank and Palestine. And I just want to pause here before I go into the occupied borderlands here in southern Arizona. What do you thoughts so far, Ben?
One thing that struck me to just think about is Guadalupe and I went to an economics conference in Nassau in the Bahamas. And we, you know us, we kind of like to hang with the people and find interesting stuff rather than being kind of like in a huge McDonald's with plastic decor. And in Nassau, the economic development, they'd actually built a moat, a literal moat around the region, around the area where all of the tourist development was. And it was like a gated walled community. And it was actually impossible for us. It wasn't impossible because we did it, but it took a half a day of effort and getting taxi drivers to break the law to transport us away from this enclave of neoliberal privatization and hotel development to get into an area that there's a beach where Bahamians or people from the Bahamas could go to, the locals. And it just really struck me to watch that phenomena of the creation of an enclave and the policing and the physical scaping, the physical hard landscaping of a zone of exclusion for the people who live there. And right now in Central America with the Garifunos in Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, you see the same sort of displacement backed with militarization and policing. In the case of Rio Dulce in Guatemala and Livingston, it's pushing the Garifunos out of the tourist district and the development of the hotels there, but they face policing issues when they come into the area where there's tourists. So looking at those images of the population of Gaza with the, there's one notion of opportunity, and there's a description of poverty being